Greetings, greetings, fellow travelers. This is Krotnip, welcoming you all back to the logbook of a simple Lindworm traveler. Oh, what exciting times we are all living right now. I was planning to do a Forces Off episode for this week, but then Corvus Belli did something pretty amazing and dropped the tournament rules for Warcrow, and I had to shuffle my release schedule around as a result. So let's take a look at this document and see what goodies are inside for all of us Warcrow enthusiasts. The competitive rules set for Warcrow is something that the player base, or at least portions of the player base, have been really eagerly looking forward to. If not for anything else, then for the simple reason that the rulebook only has 3 different scenarios in it, and those scenarios, as we are going to see, pale in comparison to what the tournament document has in store for us. So this is an important step in getting us more replayability via the new tactical and strategic challenges posed by the scenarios and their components that we are going to be talking about shortly. This document also answers questions like how many lists does one make for a Warcrow tournament? Is there a secondary scoring method akin to Infinity's classified cards? And how should the tables be set up in a competitive setting? So today we are going to be answering most of these questions via the document, but keep in mind that this is not going to be a deep dive on everything that's within the PDF. The print has just finished its job. The paint is still wet on the pages of this document, so to speak, so I will reserve deeper analysis for a later date when we have more experience playing around with the stuff that we find in here. But let's take a quick overview on what one can find inside. One of the first things that you will find when browsing through this document is some information on models and lists to use in a Warcrow event. There is a mention there that the models have to be glued or otherwise put together, which seems pretty self-evident. And they have to be mounted on right-sized bases, and they have to be Corvus Belli models. But there is no painting requirement in and of itself, even though obviously the tournament organizer can choose to have one if that's to their liking. Converting models is again allowed, and in these instances majority of the parts must come from Corvus Belli models. For those who play Infinity, this is also their conversion policy when it comes to that game, so this should sound pretty familiar. I think conversions are going to be an important part of this hobby going forward for many of us enthusiasts, since there is the situation of having several named characters that have a non-named version that does not actually have a CP provided official model, and if and when one wants to make distinct models and or include both the named and unnamed versions of said characters in their lists, there's going to be something of a conundrum on how to achieve this, even though, as we are about to see, I have an alternate solution to the problem beyond simply converting your own models. The other thing that jumps from the early pages of the document, at least at me, is the fact that Warcrow tournaments are going to be played with a single list only. And this is quite a departure from something like Infinity, where players are allowed to make 2 lists per event, and then they can optimize the lists for various scenarios, opponents, tables, and so forth. But interestingly enough, this same flexibility will not be afforded to Warcrow players. You get a single list and then you have to ride the horse that brought you to the event all the way through. So this is extremely interesting, and I'm keen to see in the future when we have a tournament meta of Warcrow, how this single list format will affect what's considered to be good and what's considered to be risky when it comes to including units and different options in the lists. Obviously, the scenarios and the way they are scored will also have its say in how lists should be constructed in the future, but we are not going to be talking about all that today. We are just going to keep this to a rather basic level. To me, the most exciting part about the new tournament rules for Warcrow is actually how the missions themselves are constructed. The basic anatomy of a Warcrow tournament mission is going to be that you have a scenario that forms the basis of the mission. Then you add a variable objective called a feat to the equation, and the resulting in its entirety is called an adventure. So let's break down what each of these terms effectively means after going through the tournament document. Firstly, there are 6 distinct scenarios that form the basis of each adventure, that is, each tournament mission for Warcrow. These scenarios are very much what one with any wargaming experience could expect. The scenarios stipulate how many objectives are placed on the field of battle, where they are located, if there are any special circumstances that come into play when it comes to trying to capture and hold them, and how are those objectives scored. And this scoring happens via military points that are always rewarded for completing the base scenario of the adventure. The scenario also tells the players how many rounds there are and how many turns there are per round, how large the deployment zones are, and so forth. So this part of the module is where you will find all the basic information. The second part is a variable secondary victory condition called a feat, and there are 5 different feats described in the original document. These are the quote-unquote classified cards of infinity brought into the Warcrow universe, and the feats will give the forces quests like headhunting specific enemy units, collecting valuable resources from the field of battle, or even sealing rifts that are generating fog to the field of battle. And completing these feats and advancing the feat will grant the company doing so arcane points. And when it comes to deciding who actually wins the game, you combine the military points gained via completing the scenario, and then you add to this the points, arcane points that you gain from advancing and completing your feat. And this will churn out a number of victory points, which will then determine whether the game is a win for either side or whether it's going to be a draw. We'll come back to how this win-draw stuff works more on the next slide, since there is a surprising amount of nuance there also. The big thing for me with this type of mission construction is the fact that I very strongly feel that Corvus Belli is taking lessons from their past experiences with their own work in Infinity, for example. I, as an Infinity player, also see a lot of the same here, but also some things have been changed as to make them better. The basic scenario plus feat anatomy can be somewhat likened to the way Infinity missions have the base mission and then the classified objectives that each force draws from their deck and then seeks to complete. But the problem with Infinity for me is that often either the classifieds are the whole mission in some of my favorite Infinity missions, or they are more of a tiebreaker than actually a means of competing for winning the scenario. Corvus Belli has been getting better in Infinity missions, giving more weight to classified cards in many missions, but altogether in Infinity you have a clearly primary way of scoring points in a mission, and then you have a very much secondary way of scoring points in most of their missions. But from a first glance it would seem that in Warcrow the scenario and the feat are both going to be more or less equally valid ways of trying to gain the upper hand in the ongoing battle. And obviously there are going to be missions or adventures rather, where the scenario is going to be difficult to get a decisive lead on, and the forces might as a result end up spending more of their attention on trying to complete their feat, or vice versa. There are also some feats, and by the dynamics of how scoring happens, some scenarios where you can effectively stop the other player from scoring something by doing something first, or keeping your opponent from doing something. And I also very much like how the scenario plus feat way of building the adventure should give in even a situation where one company gets locked out of doing something for that company still to compete for and do, and something that's going to potentially get them back into the game, or at least it will have a definite effect on how the tournament points are awarded afterwards. And this takes us neatly to the next related topic, and that is how many tournament points are granted for the players in a tournament setting after finishing a game of Warcrow. Obviously, we are going to be playing a lot of pickup games where we are playing one of these adventures as a one-off, and thus calculating the tournament points may not even be necessary, but I think it's going to be a fun exercise to do even in those instances, because there is a simple yet impactful system at play here. For those who are familiar with how the ITS, the tournament system for Infinity, awards players via tournament points, is basically the winner gets most points. If they go over a certain threshold of objective points, they get the maximum amount, and that's that. The loser can effectively gain points by just scoring a lot of objective points even if they lose, and by keeping the game close in the total objective points gained by either side. But in Warcrow, you need to determine the amount of military points and arcane points gained by each side, since this is going to play into how many tournament points each side is going to get. And this will eventually lead into one of three potential outcomes for the game. Obviously, six if we take into the account the fact that either side can score any of these results. But in a game where one side gets more victory points and more arcane points and military points as part of getting more victory points, they will have scored a supremacy type victory, and consequently their opponent has suffered a bitter defeat. And this will result in 4 tournament points for the victor and 0 for the defeated. Then again, if one side gets more victory points total than the other, but they fail to get more both military and arcane points during their game, the victor will achieve a partial triumph, which will grant them 3 tournament points, and their opponent will score a tactical retreat, which will see them walk away with a single single tournament point under their name. And if there is a tie on the amount of victory points that the sides gain, then you are simply going to have a evenly matched game, a tie, and both sides get to advance to the next round with 2 tournament points under their name. And I think this is a extremely intriguing looking table of tournaments point scoring. In Infinity, my personal experience has been that the tournament points gained can easily go really lopsided if one side starts off strong and then the other is forced to take risks in order to try and swing back the game, and as a result they lose even more, and then you get a really big objective points difference, and you end up with one player walking away with the maximum tournament points and the other walking away with effectively nothing. But in a Warcrow tournament situation, due to the lesser amount of activations and the higher importance of movement and positioning on the field of battle when it comes to scoring objectives, as well as this way of counting effectively 2 different types of victory points in the arcane and in the military point systems, means that if I am playing a game and it becomes apparent to me that okay, I'm just not gonna be able to win this one, I won't be able to compete with this scenario, for example, I'm just too far removed from being able to do that, then I can switch to trying to accumulate as many arcane points as possible. And even if my opponent is able to stop me from actually tying or winning the game via the arcane points in this situation, if I score better than my opponent when it comes to the feat completion, I still walk away from the game with that single important tournament point, which might end up being quite impactful in the final standings. And likewise, my opponent will be unable to secure a 4 tournament point victory for themselves. Obviously, it's early days and it's too soon to speculate or rather give any conclusive yes or no on how well this system is going to work, but I would speculate that it does seem that this system should drive us towards more important decisions being made later on in the games when it comes to the bigger tournament picture, and less blowout games where one side scores everything and the other side does not. Because if you're willing to forego one part of the scenario or the feat and focus on the other, it might be difficult for your opponent to pivot to stop you from doing that, while at the same time making sure that they don't leave themselves exposed to you staging a comeback via the other adventure element. So I'm really excited about this, and I can't wait to see how this turns out on the actual field of battle. Okay, now that we have covered the anatomy of adventures and how tournament points are racked up during Warcrow events, let's talk about some of the smaller details that are found in the document. There are a couple of things mentioned there that relate to how the game is supposed to be set up going forward. Firstly, there's a part about hidden information that basically says that the presence of all units in each player's list is considered hidden information until the set models are deployed on the field of battle. And I think this is a nice thing to spell out because this means that there is no ambiguity about when the presence of a unit or a model should become public to your opponent. If this ruling is to be followed in the strictest of sense, that would also mean that you aren't allowed to place models next to the table in order to tell slash misinform your opponent what you are about to deploy, but obviously enforcing this rule as is going to be a bit tricky, especially in an environment where where all the players are going to have only a single list for the event. I feel that in an Infinity event where there are two lists for every person, for example, it's not so dangerous if people wander around the gaming area once their game is finished and go and see how their friends are doing. But strictly speaking, this type of behavior would not be okay in a Warcrow event, since you would by the nature of only having one list, um, for sure get to see what other people are bringing, and this is supposed to be hidden information at that stage. But I don't think this is going to be a problem. I think this is something where we can use our own um, own senses on what's the type of behavior we want to see and what's the type of behavior we want to avoid. So there's no problem in that for me at least. There's also a section about preparing for the game, and the important part on this is that there is um, no text, no mention of how to set up the table, which leads to the conclusion, at least for me, that going forward we are going to be seeing pre-made tables in Warcrow events. And this is something that I like very much. I have enjoyed the mini game that is placing terrain before a game of Warcrow, and there are some tactical decisions to be made there for sure. But this, in my experience, has oftentimes led to a table that's not very thematic and not always very functional, since both players are looking to gain the upper hand in the way they place the terrain. And I think that by having pre-made tables, we can rest assured that we are going to see more thematic, cooler tables that are not um, extreme in any sense, and I like the thought of that. This also cuts down the amount of time required for each game in a tournament setting, since you don't have to redo the terrain for each and every game. So I like this quite a lot. Obviously, some people may lament losing the pre-game step of building the terrain with their opponent, but I find this to be quite a good decision. Next up, there was a part in the document called Units Lost in the Fog, and this is essentially a banned models list for the tournament scene as of right now. And this list of units lost in the fog includes all the Warcraft Adventures characters minus Vergana, the mercenary assassin whose card was just released to us as a PDF. Um, Obviously, banning these models as of right now does not mean that they won't be playable in the future. And obviously, tournament organizers are surely free to choose to make a ruling that these models are going to be allowed. But personally, I don't see banning these models for the time being to be too much of a problem. There are some rules issues as to some of the models in this list. For example, Darak, the Wildling, the card seems to have a problem rules-wise. It seems to be the idea that he's capable of sacrificing his movement action in order to get a second shot each turn, but actually the rules as written don't support this. And there are smaller issues with some of the other models in this regard. So if I had to place a bet, I'd bet that these models will become available for the tournament scene at a later date, maybe for the next season of competitive Warcrow, and the cards themselves get a refresh where CB goes over them again and updates them as necessary. So as a proud owner of Warcrow Adventures, I don't see this to be a problem. There have been some quite disappointed sounding people voicing their feelings in the Discord, for example, after the document was released, but I'm personally not one of those people. I already talked about how there is this situation with Warcrow where we are lacking many of the non-character models whose cards came with a named character, and we need to do conversion work in order to build such models. Or, as of this unit's last in the fog ruling, I think using the Warcrow Adventures models is going to be a fine way of replacing the models that we don't actually have a specific model for. Talking about Northern Tribes, for example, I think Ormuk should make a fine or contender, for example, or somebody might even use him as the Wrath main, for example. Iriavik makes for an excellent Varang tattooist, and so forth. So I personally have absolutely no problem with this ruling, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things go going forward. I also think that having a precedent of a banned effectively banned models for competitive play isn't a bad one to set. If it turns out that some unit is problematic for whatever reason, banning it for a short while we are expecting a fix from CB is a valid choice. Then again, in a world where cards can be updated digitally and we can get an almost instant fix as long as CB is aware of the problem and willing to address it, I don't think this should be coming up all too much going forward. There were also surprisingly two specific card updates or erratas in the competitive play document. I'm a bit surprised that we find these erratas here, and as of my last checking, these weren't part of the official updates in the general FAQ document. I don't understand why, but maybe this is something that will come up and get updated there also later. Hopefully, maybe. Who knows? But anyway, the two changes or updates are that to the Hegemony of Embersic Engineers Explosives ability and the Siennan Druids Defenders of the Great Forest ability. Firstly, the Engineer's Explosives has been updated as to not be applicable for impassable terrain when it comes to the change of keywords associated with the ability. So the basic gist of the engineer using the explosives ability is that they set up a timed charge on a piece of terrain, and then the piece of terrain effectively gets blown up, and as a result it turns into a rugged terrain with black dice cover attached to it, as there's effectively now a giant hole and some ruins or charred woods or whatever afterwards. And this is something that works very well with terrain like, let's say, a forest, for example, where we have a defined outline of the terrain, and it's the type of terrain where you are supposed to be able to place your models anyway. So it's effectively just going to be a change of some keywords. And for example, the Sienna elves will be very, very sad to see their forest blown into smithereens in this way. But if we have a table, let's say in a tournament where we have a farmhouse, that's a building and impossible terrain, and then you would have the ability of the engineer to blow that up as to it become rugged and cover, then it would necessitate you being able to place models on the set previously impassable terrain, and this might be difficult to facilitate unless you have a 2D cutout of the building placed underneath. So I think that this ruling's main point is that it stops such a contingency from being necessary. You can't transform impassable terrain into non-impassable via the use of explosives. I was also thinking that maybe this has something to do with objectives, but as the terrain would still remain there, I don't think blowing up objectives, transforming them into rugged and cover would have all that big of an impact on the game. So, and I'm not entirely sure that explosives are applicable to objectives anyway. Actually, now that I think of it, they probably aren't. So I think it's the impassable terrain conundrum that has resulted in this update. The second update is effectively something that many people were already speculating. The Defenders of the Great Forest ability on the Druid allows the Sienna player to place a piece of forest terrain on the battlefield before beginning the game. The original text referenced a piece of forest terrain equal to a square of 7 strides by side, which led to the rules lawyers on the forums to discuss whether you could, for example, make a really thin and really long stretch of forest effectively going through the entire table, and this obviously wasn't the idea. Also, what the dimensions of the forest could be and should be, and at what point you trigger a command closure from your opponent. But now it's been stated that the forest has to fit within a 7 by 7 stride area, so there is no confusion there. We are going to see some extremely geometrically accurate forests going forward, but hey, they are magical forests, and obviously there's nothing stopping you from making your forest irregular in shape as long as it fits within a 7 by 7 stride area. Another thing about the Warcrow Adventures models that's found on the document is the bigger than they look ruling, which simply states the thing that has already been communicated in many ways, but now it's definitely official. The Warcrow Adventures large-based models are mounted on too small of a basis, since the bases from the Warcrow Adventures are 55 millimeters and the large bases of Warcrow are supposed to be 60 millimeters. So there is some rebasing work to be done. I haven't gotten around to doing mine because I wanted to be absolutely sure so that I don't mess anything up. But now we have the official confirmation, so I'll get to doing this soon enough. Is this a bit annoying? Sure. Is this anything major to get angry about? Absolutely not. We are hobbyists, are we not? I think this is something we can live with, and I'm certain that the future general release versions of these Warcrow adventures, large-based models, will be on right-sized basis. So this is a one-time inconvenience. And truth be told, having access to effectively a nearly an entire faction worth of models in one purchase at the stage at which these models became available was pretty great. So I'm not going to hold a crutch over having to enlarge the base a bit. So no problems there for me. Okay, time to finally wrap this one up. I personally feel that the release of the competitive rules that we have now seen was the last major thing holding back Warcrow as a game. Soon we will have two more or less fully released factions that we have access to, and also two partially released factions in the Science of Yaldabao and the Siennan, and the new release cycles for the Feudum and what's going to be the general release of the Science are also about to start, which means that soon enough only Mount Haven will be out of the game entirely. While it took some time for the rules updates to get going, the rules themselves, the core rules of the game, have been updated in a excellent fashion, at least from where I stand. And now the rules themselves seem clear and competent enough that now we can enjoy the game from that aspect entirely. The only thing basically beyond the factions and the rules themselves that was holding us back was the lack of enough missions for us to have a truly diverse and repeatable gaming experience, playing the three missions from the rule book over and over and over again, or maybe playing some variations of the Winds from the North campaign did get old after a while, and there was a distinct feel of those scenarios, especially the rulebook ones, not being complete in a way. But now I really feel that the missing piece has been found. The adventure way of building scenarios through, or the missions through scenarios and feats is really intriguing, and I can't wait to get going and start experimenting with the different scenarios, the different feats, and how they work together. So at this point there is nothing stopping us from venturing into the fog and finding what awaits there. So I challenge you now, fellow travelers, are you with me? Are you prepared to take on the adventures that await? Hope to see you again soon.